Hello and welcome to the Global Humanities podcast exploring Curtin University's education ecosystem from the perspective of our globally connected faculty. My name is Darryl Tynen and I am the International Recruitment Consultant in the Faculty of Humanities. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which Curtin University is located, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Dr. Per Henningsgaard is a lecturer in professional writing and publishing in Curtin University's School of Media, Creative Arts and Social Inquiry. Born and raised in the Midwest of the United States, Per completed a bachelor's degree at the prestigious Vassar College in New York. He worked as an editing assistant at a multinational publishing house in New York City before coming to Perth to complete a PhD in English and Cultural Studies at the University of Western Australia. He became a teaching assistant at UWA and then a sessional lecturer at Curtin University before returning to the US to teach at the University of Wisconsin in Stevens Point. In 2012, Per became assistant professor of English at Portland State University in Oregon. And in both of these roles, Per was director of publishing, Cornerstone Press at the University of Wisconsin and Ooligan Press at Portland State. In 2017, he returned to Perth and to Curtin University. His many publications and articles focus on the topics of book history, print culture, and publishing studies, along with Australian, regional, and post-colonial literature. It is a great pleasure for you to be joined by Dr. Per Henningsgaard. Thank you very much for being here, Per.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I'm just making sure I'm pronouncing that correctly.
You have it spot on.
Okay, good. Well, the first thing I always like to learn about my guests is just about your background and history. You grew up in the Midwest. What was it like? Tell us about your early years and your early education.
Sure. So, I was born in Minnesota, which is in the upper part of the American Midwest. I was born on a farm. My parents were hippies, kind of back to the land types. So born on a farm, and we plowed the fields with horses and had no television. And
seriously?
And used an outhouse.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And then we left the farm and moved between a few different small towns in Minnesota. The first one was a population of 1,200, and the second one was a population of about 12,000. So tiny little places. I had a pretty great upbringing. Yeah. But again, these hippie parents who had sort of strange ideas about the way to raise children and live life, and maybe a little bit countercultural to the conservative places in which I grew up.
Yeah, there are a number of smaller communities in the US that for various reasons follow that. I don't think I'll get to talk to someone who was raised to learn how to use a horse and plow before. That must be a fascinating skill to have, or it must be strange for you to then go to school and realize not everyone else is doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that, not everyone else, other people had indoor plumbing, for example. That was, that's quite a novel thing that you have. Wow. And everyone else seemed to have quite privileged experiences in comparison to mine. But of course they weren't. They were all, most of them were very working class or lower middle class. But their parents had opted to have indoor plumbing.
Opted to have plumbing.
Yeah.
I think any Australian, especially my age or a bit older, will remember the outhouse in Australia. And I've been to a few of them, and in the dim, dark hours of night where you're not sure what spiders are lurking, it's a little frightening for a small child.
Exactly.
You threw me for a 6 on that one. I didn't expect that. So what was your early education like? What was your high school years like?
I going to school was interesting for me in that the things that I had been taught to value by my parents were not necessarily things that were reflected in the education that I had as a young person. As I mentioned, the towns I grew up in were quite conservative towns, and they had quite limited options available to them. Mm-hmm. And my parents even were university educated, but they hadn't gone to huge, prestigious universities, but they just had kind of bigger and grander hopes and a bit more ambitious hopes for their children. And so we had been, raised to value the arts, to value culture, to look to the larger world. And those weren't necessarily reflected in the schooling that I had. And so when I finished my high school education, that was what I was looking for. Is I was looking to go to university in a place that embodied those more ambitious goals.
Which you did by going to Vassar College, one of the original Seven Sisters, very prestigious liberal arts college in, is it called upstate New York or mid-state?
I mean, I think the people in and around Vassar call it upstate New York, but people who really live in upstate New York object to that because it's only an hour and a half from New York City on a train, so it's quite close to New York City, and some people even commute from Poughkeepsie down into New York.
Unusual name, Poughkeepsie. Yeah.
Poughkeepsie.
So Vassar College, tell us about it. What was that like? What sort of size is it?
So it's about 2,400 students, so quite small. Each year group has about 600 students in it, and it's a residential college experience in the United States. So everyone who's going there is moving there, oftentimes from other parts of the country, and then they're living on campus for that experience. It was a very progressive institution, and obviously, I learned a lot from it and really enjoyed it, but it was also challenging for me. The things that I had looked for in a university proved to be things that were really challenging for me. So I wanted someplace that was more ambitious. I wanted someplace that had bigger and broader hopes and ambitions. And yet, when I went there, I was encountered by students who had come from more privileged backgrounds than myself. They had been raised with those ambitions, and they had been raised in privilege. And so I found myself feeling, strangely on the outside of that. And not that I had lots of friends and I had a great experience, but I found that to be challenging, to be a kid from a small town in the Midwest. And then you go to a place where most of the people are from big cities. They've been raised in going to private schools and having a lot of luxuries. Yeah,
there's a lot of literature and a lot of research into those issues in the United States, and I know that many people engage with it here in Australia as well, but possibly not in the same way or to the same extent. The fact that you actually experienced that must have been really interesting. Do you remember anything in particular that sort of really showed you the disconnect or the difference? What that bridge was?
I think that for me, one of the moments when it really came home was when I was confronted by our summer holidays. And in the United States, those summer holidays are a full 3 months, maybe even 3.5 months. They're quite long. And so you have a real choice at that point to make about how you're going to spend that time. It's not just a short break. You have to kind of come up with something substantial to occupy yourself. And many of my classmates were going off and doing unpaid internships at, great companies that their parents had connections to. And I was returning to my small town, and I was waiting tables at a Perkins restaurant, which is kind of a family restaurant chain. And I was, working 45 hours a week to try and earn enough money to be able to return the next semester, and have a little bit of money to spend, as well as buy books and all of those other things. So that was a real stark difference for me. And I could see very early on that had the potential to set up really different kind of career possibilities, that I wasn't getting the same experiences as my peers. And so finally, after my third year at university, I did take on one of these internships. Rather than going back to Minnesota, I moved down into New York City, got an apartment with a few friends from the university. We crammed 3 of us into a 2-bedroom place. And
tiny little place.
Tiny little place in Harlem with roaches and all of that. And
wow.
And I got an internship, but I managed to get a paid internship, which was huge. And then I
much more prevalent now, but back then
much
harder. Yeah.
Yep. And I waited tables on top of it. So I worked about 70 hours a week that summer. But it was that kind of experience of engaging with the professional world that I knew was going to stand me in good stead when I graduated.
Which it seemed to have done. Like you obviously have a love of writing. You must have learned a lot about that in university, and then went on to a publishing house. Tell us about your journey of becoming a writer and that love.
So I think it started very early. I read a lot as a kid growing up in a rural area. That is something that you can do if you don't have a television. So I read a lot as a kid.
Of course, no television.
and loved writing as well. And when I got into high school, I got involved with the high school newspaper and became the editor of the high school newspaper. And so I developed a love for publishing from that, and then went to university and got involved with a magazine at university and was an editor and a designer for that. And so I had this early connection to the worlds of writing and publishing. And so it was kind of a natural next step for me to look for a career in that area. And that's, I was very fortunate that I landed a job as an editorial assistant at a publishing house straight after graduation.
Well, tell us about that role. What was that like?
It was fantastic. It was not the sort of sexy, glamorous side of publishing. It was educational publishing. So I worked on textbooks. But it gave me a ton of skills and experience. And, I really learned what all the different parts of the publishing process looked like. So even though I was in the editorial department, and really had a chance to finesse those editorial skills, I was also regularly interacting with the designers and the marketers and the production people, and so understanding how that big system works. And then I was also fortunate in that I was working for a big multinational company, so it wasn't just our little office. There were branches all around the world, and so I got to have those connections as well. And that really led me to the next stage, which was after working for a while in publishing. I knew that I loved publishing, but I was anxious to get out of the United States and do something different, have a new experience. And so I applied for a Fulbright grant to study publishing in Australia. And it was...
Naturally, Australia.
Naturally.
You've come from small towns in the Midwest with no television and not much electricity. Yep. You've gone to one of the biggest cities, one of the most modern cities in the world, but all of it in the northern parts of the United States where winters are quite cold.
Yep.
I was telling some people recently about Boston winters. Very, very cold. And of course, the obvious choice is to come to almost literally the other side of the world, to a Mediterranean climate, to the University of Western Australia. Just
obvious.
Yes. I
That's
can
right.
definitely talk me through that.
Well, it started a little bit earlier than that. So when I was doing my bachelor's degree at Vassar College, I did the study abroad experience that many American university students do. I went and spent a semester abroad, and I was an English major, so the options that I had were fairly limited. I needed to go to an English-speaking country, and so it was really kind of a toss-up between going to the UK or Australia, and I just arbitrarily chose Australia.
A little bit more exotic from
the
American mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Strange animals, yes.
Yep. Yeah, so I spent a semester at the University of Melbourne and really enjoyed my time there. And then at the very end of that semester, after I'd finished my final exams, I embarked on a hitchhiking trip, which is not something I recommend to other people to do. But
don't do this at home.
But it was a pretty fantastic experience. And so I hitchhiked with a friend from Melbourne to Perth. And I spent 4 or 5 days in Perth, and then flew back to Melbourne and flew back to the States straight away. And so that was the very end of my experience in Australia, but it left a strong impression on me. And Perth in particular left a strong impression. It really loved the city, loved the weather, loved the beaches. And so when I, years later, when I was working and publishing and I was trying to think of, what would it look like to live overseas? Where would I want to go? Where would I want to spend some time? It occurred to me that Perth might be a place that I wanted to go back to. And one of the things about it that drew me to it, in addition to the things I've just mentioned, is that growing up in the Midwest, I really developed a connection to writing that came out of that region. And when I read writers from that region, it resonated with me in a unique and special way. And so I was interested in exploring more about, writing and publishing in areas that are outside major cultural centers. I just spent some years living in New York, which is undoubtedly a cultural center.
A mini-cultured center.
Yeah. And so going to a place like Perth offered me that opportunity to look at writing and publishing in an area that isn't a cultural center, but still has an incredibly rich cultural production.
Yeah, the geography and culture sort of coming together. And when you don't have the population base of a 25 million person city, a little bit smaller, 2 million people here, it's fascinating. The other thing that interests me is that I talk to a lot of people about who have immigrated to Perth, why they came here, and for the most part, especially with students, I'll say, well, I used to visit there for a holiday, or I went there once with my family, or I've traveled there once, and it just draws people back in. If you haven't been here, got to try it.
Yeah.
So the first time you were in Australia, though, I'd love to hear about your impressions of coming to what is ostensibly a Western country, but kind of in the East. It is considered in many ways a white European country, but is also quite diverse. Those might have been the ideas you had in your mind, as well as strange animals and spiders. What was the experience like for you, though, especially in a big city?
Yeah, it was. It really is. It really is very different. And I think an American coming to Australia, you tend to underestimate the differences coming in, and then you are regularly surprised.
Well, the coffee's better.
The coffee is so much better. It's true. It's absolutely true. I think that sometimes, because now I've spent quite a few years in Australia, I tend to forget what those early experiences are like. But then I get reminded of them when I have friends or family that come to visit me in Australia for the first time, and their experiences and the way they react to the things around them remind me, oh yeah, I remember having that same feeling. So my father came to visit me a couple years ago. I guess it was his second visit, but his first had been very short. So he came to visit me a couple years ago, and this was while I was working at Curtin, and I brought him onto campus, and we were walking around campus. And he, at some point, we were walking by all these students, and at some point he asks me, so does Curtin have a lot of international students? Are there a lot of international students here? And I was like, yeah, Curtin has a lot of international students, definitely. They come from all over the world to study here. But then I looked around and I realized that my father was asking that question because of the diversity of students that he saw around him. And I said, but you do realize, of course, that most of these students that you're seeing here are Australians. Most of them probably grew up here in Perth. But as an American, your image of Australia is a white Australia, and you're not aware of the diversity of this country until you come and spend some time here. So I was reminded that was my experience when I first arrived as well. I was like, oh my God, this is a much more diverse, multicultural country than I'd ever encountered before. And I was also really struck by the open conversations about race and diversity that this country can have. Not to say that there aren't problems in those conversations, there certainly are. But those conversations in the United States can get shoved into the background quite quickly. And
possibly for white people more than...
Yeah, absolutely. But I feel like those conversations exist in public spaces in Australia in a much more accessible way.
That's an interesting insight. I appreciate the concept from an external perspective. Sorry, getting a little bit afield. So you have finished your PhD in Perth, and you head back to the United States, and you get a role at University of Wisconsin, back in your backyard. It's a smallish town, Stevens Point.
Yes, yeah, definitely a small town. A population of about 20,000, and 10,000 of those are students. So really a kind of classic American college town.
Yeah. This gives me a chance to actually ask about something I'm interested in. Your name, Per Henningsgaard, I assume I'm pronouncing that right. Swedish, I believe. Yep. So it's that Germanic background. You grew up in Minnesota and around that area, in Wisconsin, and it's well known for the fact that many of the earlier European immigrants were Germanic, or from the German lowlands or German populations. Do you have a heritage through that you can draw on? Do you have an understanding of it from your ancestors?
So I definitely do have a heritage that connects to that. So Minnesota in particular has a very strong representation of Scandinavian populations there, as well as Germanic and a little bit of French, and that's exactly where my heritage traces back to. So my name really comes out of that Scandinavian tradition, very common in Sweden, Norway. But that history is quite distant for me. Our family was not recent immigrants or anything like that. It was many generations back. So my name is...
Your first name indicates that it may have been more recent.
Yeah, no, not at all. So really just oddball hippie parents who... my dad read a book right before I was born. The main character's name is Per Henningsgaard. And he really liked that name, and so that was the name I was given. It's Per Henningsgaard.
Well, that is not what I expected.
Yeah.
Yes, no, that's great. So you're now teaching. You're a professor at the University of Wisconsin. You're running the student-run publishing organization. That must have been a great experience.
It was an incredible experience. It really was a perfect place for me to find my kind of first full-time job as an academic. It allowed me to bring together the things that I had learned during my PhD along with the professional experience that I'd had working in the publishing industry and really create a kind of unique opportunity for myself. So we ran a publishing house and it was staffed by undergraduate students, and they worked incredibly hard every semester to produce a really professional quality book, working with real authors, putting real books out into the world, selling them in bookstores. It was all based on real money paid, and we had to earn it back. And so it was an incredible experience for me and for them to be involved with that kind of organization.
And you were able to do something very similar when you moved to Portland State. You've been on the East Coast, now you're on the West Coast, you've been in the middle. It's sort of like you've been across all areas of the US. But now you're in Oregon, again, a fairly liberal area, but in a very different way. How was that experience different from the University of Wisconsin?
When I was at the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point, I was working primarily with undergraduate students doing their bachelor's degree, and the publishing piece that we worked on was a very small part of what they studied. And so when I moved to Portland, I was working with students who were postgraduate students. They were studying for a master's degree. They came there for 2 years specifically to study publishing, and so they were much more devoted. They had already a more advanced skill set coming in. And so we could kind of level up at that point. We're also in a bigger city, and you have access to a lot more resources there. And there's a bigger and richer kind of publishing community that we could tap into and draw upon their skill set as well. So that was, for me, a really exciting opportunity to kind of build on the skills and experiences I developed from my time at the University of Wisconsin and build those during my time at Portland.
And during this period, you were also running your own publishing company, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So in both the University of Wisconsin and in Portland State University, there are these publishing houses and that I was responsible for heading up. And the students would form our staff, but we, the staff, the academics in these universities, we would kind of make the big decisions if big decisions needed to be made. We wanted to empower the students to make decisions, but we also wanted to be able to hold the reins a little bit to say, no, we're going to lose thousands of dollars if we do that. And so, we would guide it in that way. And that was great because at Portland State University, we were able to produce books that won awards, that sold thousands of copies, that launched authors' careers, and they would go on to bigger and better things afterwards. So it was a really exciting thing to be involved with.
Sometimes the constraint of the funds that you have as a smaller publishing house, as really thinking about the public good coming out of a university, in some ways that can constrain you, but in other ways that can release you to be a little bit more bold, try new things. What are some of your, I guess, favorite or proudest publishing efforts during those periods?
Oh boy!
Sorry, I didn't prepare you.
No,
for that question.
That's a great question. So I think that you're absolutely right. Those constraints are both constraining, but also incredibly liberating because they really force you to think in creative ways and do things with a small budget, which is great preparation for all kinds of different workplaces that you might find yourself in, not just in publishing. So one of the really proud achievements that we had was we were publishing a book. This was at Ooligan Press at Portland State University. We're publishing a book. It was a young adult book, and it was a book about the journey of a teenage girl, discovering her sexuality and eventually coming out as gay. And we were trying to figure out how to connect this book with the audience, with the people that it would most resonate with. And so we were trying lots of different things, and we don't have the money to go and just buy advertising on Amazon or those kinds of big ticket items. So we were trying lots of different things, and one of our students had the idea to send a letter to this pop rock band called Tegan and Sarah, which they're this Canadian duo. They're sisters, and they're both very out lesbian women, and also they both
so significant members of the LGBTQ
significant members, absolutely, and they both happen to be readers, and we knew this because their social media presence. They sometimes would tweet or Instagram about things they were reading, and so we sent them our book. We sent them a letter. We tailored it to them, and then sure enough, Tegan read the book and she posted about it on all of her socials, and it went crazy, and
That's
it
fantastic.
really connected with a community of people. So it was exciting for us because we'd done something with no budget. We had then made a sales success, but even more importantly, we'd connected a book with a really important message with the kind of people
with the community itself,
that wanted that book.
Just finding that person, that potentiality, and as you say, tailoring the letter to them and really thinking about that. It's smart going.
Yeah,
must have been
absolutely.
a great learning experience for the students as well.
Yeah, a huge learning experience, because you can teach that lesson in a classroom. You can say this is what you have to do, but when someone actually executes on it, and when someone has the idea and follows through on it, that's a much more valuable lesson.
Back to Perth and Curtin University. Again, back onto the other side of the world. As I said, it draws you back in somehow. What led you to come back?
I think there were a lot of different factors in that decision. I'd been at Portland State University for 5 years, so to a certain extent, I had accomplished the kinds of things that I wanted to accomplish there. But also there was just, just the fact that the job came up in my area. It was a job that was, I thought perfectly tailored for my skills and my interests. And you don't pass those opportunities by. You at least need to throw your hat in the ring. Adding on to that, I had somewhere in all of that, I had met and married a girl whose family is here in Perth. So she had been with me for 8 years in the United States. And it was time to return the favor. And then I think the cherry on top of that was that, when I had my interview with Curtin University, it was really clear to me that they were going to offer me a lot of freedom to shape the units in a way that I thought they would best be shaped, so that I could put my mark on the kinds of things that I'd be teaching here, and take all of the lessons that I'd learned over the past 8 years of teaching and really apply them here. And I thought that was a really special opportunity and not one to pass up.
Well, talk about that a little bit. Which units are you teaching, and what have you been able to create?
So I teach 2 units that are specifically publishing related. So I teach an editing unit for second-year students, where they learn the skills of copy editing and proofreading and structural editing. I also teach a third-year unit that is a kind of introduction to the publishing industry as a whole. So we do editing, but we also do marketing, design, production, the whole kind of kit and caboodle. So those are the 2 publishing units that I teach. I also teach a third-year unit that is called Writing and Research for Professional Contexts, which is about writing for the industry, writing for government, writing for the workplace, trying to get the students really prepared for all of the different kind of writing-related roles that they might be entering into upon graduation. And then the final unit that I coordinate is a professional writing placement unit, so where we actually place students in organizations external to the university, and they undertake an internship over the course of the semester. And that's organizations like publishing houses, but also in government, in for-profit companies, in not-for-profit arts organizations, all kinds of different organizations that employ communications professionals, and that's what many of our students are training to be. Fantastic.
Okay, final question. What is your favorite part about teaching?
I really love the opportunity to connect individually with students. So the lecture hall is not my native environment. I don't particularly enjoy being up there and putting on a performance. I can do that, but it's not the first thing that I look for. So I look for those opportunities to connect one-on-one. So oftentimes when I'm running a tutorial or running a seminar, I will try and build moments into that experience where the students are working in small groups or in partners on something, and I have the opportunity to go around and speak to those small groups or to individuals and look at the particular things that they're working on and give them that individualized feedback, and then build that individual connection that can inform all kinds of other developments.
That sounds amazing. Dr. Per Henningsgaard, it sounds like you've really found your place. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been the Global Humanities Podcast, and I guess we'll see you next time.